So, stupid question, Maxine giggled with embarrassment. Do you know how to drive a diesel engine? They were in a rather awkward position now. Diesel's driver was long gone, probably taking up a new identity somewhere in Manchester, but considering the man had been trying to kill them with a shunter's pole earlier that morning, they didn't exactly miss him either. Marcel shook their head. Not a clue. Why, it's easy, declared an oily voice. Just a bit of oil and a touch on the starter. I'll even walk you through it. So, reluctantly, Marcel reached out toward the diesel engine's cab. The door seemed almost to fly open invitingly. Both driver and stoker were startled. Marcel had only touched it. Come in, please. And his face stretched into that nauseating grin. Travel in modern comfort. I'm temperature controlled. Thomas got wise to what was going on and was furious. Are you trying to steal my crew? He fumed frantically. You conniving, oily down boy. Maxine cut him off and held her hand out to temper him. We'd never dream of trading you for anyone. Thomas knew that, of course, but it was still insulting that Diesel would try to tempt them, and temptation was the word. He oozed poison charisma from every vent. I've got the whole route planned out. Follow my instructions, and this whole journey will be completed swiftly and efficiently. And he grinned self-assuredly. Driver and fireman looked at each other with trepidation. There was something off about the way he was talking to them. He wasn't really talking like an engine. Marcel pulled Maxine aside, and they spoke in hushed tones. Can we talk for a moment about the fact that this is a locomotive we're taking advice from? Maxine scratched her head. Well, Thomas gives us advice all the time, Marcy. And she winked, as all Sudrians do when they talk about the whims of their engines. But Marcel was not reassured. Like he'll drag us downhill, or he'll refuse to start sharply if he thinks there's danger ahead. They caught their breath, clearly unsettled. But he doesn't give us instructions. He doesn't make route plans. Maxine also looked uncomfortable, but she was doing her best to construct an explanation. She fell back on her heritage, of course. You're a Sudrian, just as I am. You must believe that engines have a life all their own, eh? Of course I do, but not the same sort of life as you and me, you know? Not... And she really whispered this part because it was crazy, and because she didn't want the diesel engine to hear her. Intelligent life. I will now take a moment to remind you that Thomas is a tank engine. He's not a man. He's not even a boy. He's a tank engine. And only that. Now, I assure you, he is the liveliest tank engine you will ever meet. He's rambunctious, he's unpredictable, and he never gives up. But he is still just a tank engine. He does have wants, needs, and preferences, as any machine does. A car needs oil and wants smooth roads, and Thomas is much like that. But he doesn't have thoughts, at least none that he can speak aloud. That, dear audience, is what you need me for. I'm trying my best to translate. He doesn't really talk, even though he has a lot to say. My visits to Sodor are lovely, but they are no cartoon. Thomas is merely a tank engine. Which is why it should alarm you greatly that on this cloudy day in 1988, in the middle of Manchester yards, this '08 shunter, a machine designed and built by people to pull carriages and goods stock, was making travel plans and providing geographical knowledge. He wasn't making suggestions. He wasn't influencing his crew with his movements or his strength or his slowly depleting gas tank. He spoke to them in plain English and told them where to go. This should scare you, because it scares me, and it happened 40 years ago. That, my friends, is why Marcel and Maxine were so pale. They looked back toward the engines. For a moment, their Thomas, beloved and cherished as he was, had nothing more than a big black door where that famous mug of his usually was, And they didn't so much as shrug. It wasn't how they thought of him, but it was true. He had the decency to lose the face when they were shoveling ash out of his smoke box, at least. It was the nature of these things. But Diesel did not have a grill. Diesel had a face. And it wouldn't go away. He sneered at them. "That thing is evil," whispered Marcel, under their breath. They blinked, and the face was gone at last. Both engines were just engines, albeit very special ones. Reality was restored to normal. Perhaps the mainlanders were right. Perhaps Sudrians really were crazy. I don't know what conclusion the driver and fireman came to that day. Perhaps they concluded that it was exhaustion talking and they were simply a little delirious. Perhaps they convinced themselves that Diesel's plan was their own, and it was merely of subconscious origin. But either way, they decided that heading for Southampton was the thing to do. Manipulating trucks, now that was easy. That's what shunters are meant to do. Manipulating people, now that is impressive. Diesel was pleased. I'm sure you have questions. So do I. Agreeing on a travel plan was only half the battle. Now they had to navigate the British rail network all the way to Southampton, without official permission. This was a major infraction. Both driver and fireman knew that, and even the term infraction was generous. They were only using it so they wouldn't have to use the word illegal. But they couldn't risk Thomas ending up in the clutches of British Rail. The company already had an unsettling amount of control over Sodor itself. They were in the lion's den now, and there was no telling how they'd treat Thomas as a trespasser when they had already threatened him and his friends for so long as foreigners. But it would have been madness to venture along the main line with no oversight at all. It would have been safer and wiser to drive Thomas directly into the sea. At least then they'd die from drowning instead of a fiery train wreck. No, somebody had to be aware of where they were and keep the other trains at bay while they passed through. And that somebody was the signalman. They would have to let him know, but only him, and nobody above him. Like a brave little Great Western engine in his strange train had once done before. The first signal box was on the outskirts of the yard, where the ballast was just beginning to dwindle, and the rolling hills were starting to return. Diesel dragged Thomas as far as the master points and halted there. Going any further would put them in the path of mainline traffic. "I don't like being here, Diesel," confessed Thomas. "I mean, it's daylight now. What if somebody sees me?" "Somebody undoubtedly will," he said, not comforting Thomas in the slightest. "But as long as you're with me, you will be fine. I'll explain that I'm escorting you back to Sodor, where you have proper running permits. Or, if we encounter a particularly zealous engine," and he smiled, actually finding the idea rather humorous, "I'll tell them you're my prisoner, and that we're headed to the nearest scrapyard." "Oh, joy!" Thomas rolled his eyes. "How very kind of you." As the two engines began to bicker, Maxine dropped from the cab and darted across the yard to meet the signalman for herself. It was a bigger signal box than any of the ones on Sodor, probably because the yard itself was bigger than any of those back home. She was winded by the time she reached the upper floor of the box, so she paused for breath outside. She straightened her jacket and slicked back her hair, as if it would make any difference to the stern, conventionally dressed man inside. He was either going to admire her unique sense of fashion, or deem her a hippie and kick her back down to the ballast. Sadly, she had experienced the latter before. Not that it would ever deter her, of course. 3 hard knocks on the door got the man's attention. After some slow footsteps and a gentle twist of the knob, out popped a middle-aged fellow with a red shirt far too exciting for his bored expression. He only glanced briefly at Maxine's spiked hair. It didn't much faze him. "Can I help you?" Maxine smiled, relieved that he seemed to be subdued. "Yes, you can. That's my engine down there, and his, friend." And she pointed to the strange consist. This shook the sleepy look from the signalman's face. That's a Fat Controller's engine. One of his drivers, yes, and mighty proud of it. It was then that the signalman was struck by a dreadful realization. You're gonna ask me to do something ridiculous, aren't you? Maxine just clapped his shoulder. Mate, I'm afraid so. Listen, truth be told, I like your railway. But if you need me to override control, well, I don't know, His predicament was obvious. Maxine was about to ask a lot of him, so she looked for a way to take the pressure off. She spied a racing poster behind him, hung dead center on the signal box wall. You like rally racing? She asked, swiftly changing the subject. The man's eyebrows shot up into his hat, clearly frightened that she'd just read his mind. But then he came to his senses and swung back around, gazing back toward his poster. Yes, I'm a big fan. You got a favourite racer, then? The signalman grunted under his breath and scratched his cap. He knew he really should be reporting this woman this instant. But on the other hand, nobody ever wanted to hear him babble on about his love of rally racing. Michelle Mouton, he said slowly, but his enthusiasm only grew from there. Oh, she tore up every track she touched. I followed all her races. That face-off between her and Walter Roll, where she won Brazil. Oh, I was on the edge of my seat with that one. Oh, so was I. I caught the whole thing from the couch. And then she shrugged, and with some embarrassment put in, and the footplate. She was the best. Really upset things. I like an upsetter, me. Yeah, Michelle was something else. I knew her when she was starting out. I even gave her a few tips. The signalman's jaw dropped like a signal under snow. You're joking. But his face said, tell me more. Oh, yeah, at Le Mans in 75. I wasn't driving anymore by that point, but, well, I never missed Le Mans. You drove? In the 60s, yeah. I never broke into the international circuit, but I had quite a few local wins. What was once a tense and interrogatory conversation had quickly spilled over into a passionate discussion of all things racing. Both driver and signalman were gushing like school children when Marcel finally came up to see what the holdup was and tapped their watch expectantly. We had really better be going, blushed Maxine. We're bound for Southampton, and her voice heightened ever so slightly. Is there any way you could get us through? The signalman rubbed his cap. Not that far. But I can signal you through as far as Sheffield. Oh, that's more than helpful, smiled Maxine. You're a lifesaver. The signalman nodded, only once. Just don't set any records. But the little twinkle in his eyes said he sort of wanted her to. It was a long way to Sheffield at only 20 miles per hour. Diesel was clearly embarrassed. He tried to go faster, but there was simply no way. It was dark by the time they arrived. After some more desperate bartering with a yard foreman, the driver and fireman were given passage to some derelict carriage sheds to park the engines in for the night. It probably helped that the foreman was barely awake and desperate to get home himself. Despite Thomas's pleas, the two engine folk ventured into town to find a hotel. You can't leave us here, please, he panted, his eyes darting around the shed. No one will even know you're here, Marcel reassured him. No one of this realm, Thomas said darkly, and he took mental note of the cobwebs all over the shed and a few old engine parts scattered beside the tracks. It dawned on Maxine what he was on about. Ah, Thomas, she pinched her nose. There are no ghosts in this shed. Diesel just stared, awestruck that this was even a consideration. Thomas denied it, of course. Well, no, hold on. Ghosts? Oh, the very thought. No, I'm just worried we'll be found out, that's all. Driver and fireman just shook their heads, gave Thomas a good oiling, and shut the doors tight. There were 2 beds somewhere in Sheffield with their names on them. One late-night taxi ride and an alarmingly high hotel bill later, they were winding down in a decent, comfortable little establishment. It wasn't much, but considering the alternative was the cold, hard steel floor of their warm-hearted engine, it was a welcome alternative. They both sat on their beds, facing each other. By total accident, or perhaps subconsciously, Maxine had selected the left bed and Marcel the right, the same positions they tended in Thomas's cab. Maxine pulled her boots off with clunky, sleepy movements. What a mess, eh, Marcel? Maxine. Marcel braced their hands on their knees and leaned forward intensely. We need to call Sir Topham Hatt. Maxine put down her boots. Her mouth went as straight as was possible, and she furrowed her brow at the proposition. We'd probably ought to, but Maxine trailed off. But, Marcel gestured, rolling their hands over one another, trying to draw the rest of the sentence out. We're only here because we made some, she searched for the least extreme word, rash decisions. Nothing we've done in the last few days complies with standard railway procedure. Marcel just groaned under their breath. That was painfully obvious. We owe the Fat Controller an explanation, insisted Marcel, even if it reflects badly on us. Sir Stephen Hatt was not the same man that had hired Marcel all those years ago, but he was his father's son, and for all the ways he differed from Sir Charles, he was every bit as honorable. Marcel's loyalty was unwavering. And so, too, was Maxine's. I agree, Marcy. I'm more worried about what the railway board will say. If they find out he was complicit. It dawned on Marcel what the driver was implying. It was a good point. He probably will defend us, won't he? And the more he knows about our actions, the harder will be to defend. Maxine managed to say it with a straight face, but a moment afterward, she grinned toothily and snickered. They sounded like criminals. And perhaps they were. Right, we'll handle this ourselves then, agreed Marcel. But then they pointed firmly at the driver. For now. Yes, for now, smiled Maxine, and with nothing else to say on the subject, she collapsed backwards into bed and began snoring almost immediately. Marcel, on the other bed, was up for some time.